Absolutely. I think bang for your buck, quality versus price point, you cannot beat sherry. I mean, all of our wines are, rated 90 points or higher if, you care about that sort of thing. I know a lot of consumers do, and it is a good benchmark, for people who don't really know, wine that well. But just sherry in general, bang for your buck, like you said, a lot of time and effort and care has gone into these products. And when you can buy a 95 point wine for 20 bucks. It's like, why wouldn't you?
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Decoding Cocktails podcast. I'm your host, Chris LeBeau. At the ripe age of 38, I left my former career behind and joined the hospitality industry. Since then, I've been on a rapid journey of learning, meeting all sorts of great people, and this podcast is my chance to bring you along with me, whether I'm interviewing somebody that works in the industry, another enthusiast, or occasionally stepping back to share what I'm working on or my thoughts. I'm so glad you're here, and so with that aside, let's get into today's episode. What's happening, friends? Welcome back for another episode of Decoding Cocktails. I am Chris LeBeau, and today we kind of wade a little deeper into the waters. To me, still thinking about the average cocktail journey for most people, and spirits journey. It really begins, to that point, with spirits. We become very interested in things like a whiskey or a gin or a mezcal, etc. But I think after time, if you begin tiptoeing deeper into the waters, you encounter two other little categories. You encounter various liqueurs and also a variety of fortified and aromatized wines that are there. And to that end, today we're going to talk about sherry. My guest is Stephen Dragun. He is the national brand ambassador for Emilio Lustau. And you can find them online at Bodegas Lustau, Lustau. This will be in the show notes, along with Stephen. His Instagram handle, his name, Stephen, Dragun. And I wanted to have Stephen on because sherry is something that I have brought up before on this show. And yet it is something that even though I've tried it, had it in cocktails, read a whole book on it, it is a category that I feel like for me still is one of the most cognitively vexing, right up there with, and really honestly exceeding probably even the agave category. There's a lot going on in agave, but the processes by which sherry can be brought to life, the fact that this category can all in one include what is the driest wines in the world, basically, as well as many of the sweetest wines in the world, this entirely broad category. And the fact that when you taste many of these things, and I asked Stephen about some of his earliest memories in the category, that many of these wines are also very jarring because of the processes by which we encounter them. I think about coffee is a great example. The first time you taste coffee, many people don't go, "Oh, I love this." Sherry is another thing that's very much an acquired taste, yet it is extremely versatile in the cocktail world in terms of the flavors and characteristics it can bring to a drink. Sherry also is important for us to look at because mixologists really have helped bring it back. And yet, for most of us, it still has this thing of I never watched the show Frasier, but I gather there they were all in their snooty academic world, kind of carrying on about it. Or it's something you remember your grandmother cooked with, or just was something that elderly people in your life drank that you haven't really messed around with. And so this is something that a lot of bartenders are employing, and yet it is still this topic that for most of us is very out of reach. So I brought Stephen in, talk a little bit about his background of how he got there, but to really help walk us through sherry as a category. How do we use it? How do we think about cooking with it in great ways? And to really help hopefully give you a basic primer on this tool that a lot of people at the cutting edge and even a lot of the normal edges now are using. How do you begin to employ this on your bar shelf at home? In additional reference, the author Talia Baiocchi has an entire book on sherry. I will link out to that as well. But here you are, my episode and interview with Stephen Dragun.
Jamendo.com.
Stephen, thanks so much for taking some time to chat today. I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, my absolute pleasure. It's great to be here.
Sherry is something that is it's very popular whether people listening or not know it in cocktails these days, and yet for the lay person out there it is still very much this oftentimes a more obscure thing. Is there a moment you remember tasting sherry for the first time, or the moment where you were like, God, I gotta dig into this? Where do you remember where you were, and what was that like?
I do. Like most people in the beverage world, I got into sherry via cocktails. As you mentioned, it's very popular as a cocktail ingredient for several reasons, which we can talk about later. But I had used it before, but I remember in 2015 is when I really started to get into it. I had used like the Amontillado before. I'd used the cream sherry, but I mean, the first time I tried Fino, I remember it was like, wow, what is going on here? I remember I didn't even know if I liked it initially because it was so jarring. The flavors you come across in the biologically aged wines, you really don't encounter anywhere else. Extremely dry, essentially no sugar, very, very salty and briny and bready, yeasty. And so I remember it took me a few times, to taste, tasting it to really understand and get into it. And I always like to equate it to like the first time you have a really smoky scotch, like Lafroig or Lagavulin. It's like, well, this is a whiskey, but man, it is just behaving so differently from the rest of the whiskey category. And I feel the same thing about sherry is, especially the biologically aged wines. It is a fortified wine, but boy, it is acting, radically different from most of the other fortified wines that are out there. So yeah, around 2015 is when I really started to become a sherry head. And then I would say maybe 4 to 6 months later is when I started working for Lustau. So it's kind of funny how it all came together for me in that regard.
Wow, that is a pretty quick turnaround. But I remember, and I when I'm sharing sherry with people for the first time, or it's one of their in maybe not the first time, but early on. I remember in her book, and this is certainly a last name that always trips me up, but Talia
Yeah, yeah, Baiachi.
Bayachi. Anyways, but I remember her saying very clearly in the book, sherry is not very rarely is love at first taste, that we bump into it and we go, wow, this is different. This is and I do think about reminding people that a lot of times when you had coffee or a beer for the first time, you probably didn't like it, but yeah, this is something that is certainly very, very strange on the palate when people bump into it.
Yeah, absolutely. It is very much an acquired taste. But then there's also, a common misconception, especially here in the States. Everyone thinks sherry is like port, which it can be. There are sherries that, are around the same sugar level, have a very similar flavor profile. So it can be like port, but in actuality, 95% of sherry production are the drier wines, the ones that, people don't come across. So, the Fino Manzanilla, the Amontillado, the Palo Cortado, and, the Oloroso. So I think we still have a long way to go as far as getting people to understand the category as a whole, because right now it's still very much seen as an after dinner drink, a dessert wine pour.
So clearly doing this for Lustau, and I remember hearing you say in an interview, and I thought it was great that clearly you're representing the company, but really you are representing the category because Sherry just has so much PR to overcome. But I remember also when I was digging into the book, this idea that sherry is, 3,000 years old. It's been happening in this southern corner of Spain for all this time. If we're starting at the beginning with someone to talk to them about sherry as a category, Stephen, how do we begin to orient them as to what we're looking at? Because then obviously the nuance really begins to emerge from there.
Right. So, I mean, the definition of sherry is it's fortified wine from the southwest part of Spain. Currently, as it stands, it has to be aged in the Sherry Triangle. And the Sherry Triangle is comprised of 3 towns: Jerez de la Frontera, which is the main town, Sanlúcar de Barrameda, which is further west, close to this river that separates Spain and Portugal, and then El Puerto de Santa Maria, further south, which is on the bay. And so, these 3 towns are probably a 30-minute drive from one another. So it's a, very small part of the world. So yeah, it's a fortified wine from the southwest part of Spain with various styles ranging from very dry to very sweet. So, right off the bat, we essentially have 9 different styles. Fino, Manzanilla, which are essentially the same exact wine. The only difference is Fino is aged in Jerez or El Puerto, and Manzanilla is aged in Sanlúcar de Barrameda. That is the only difference, and to the point where a lot of producers might even make all of the wine in Jerez and will ship it to the other 2 towns for aging. So that's the only difference between Fino and Manzanilla, is just the town and where it's aged. And those are what we call biologically aged wines, in that they age under a layer of yeast their entire life. So we have those. Then we have the oxidative, the dry oxidative wines, which are the Amontillado, the Palo Cortado, and the Oloroso. The Amontillado and Palo Cortado, we designate these as being dual aged, in that they start off as a biologically aged wine, and then they transition into an oxidatively aged wine. So essentially, they start off as a Fino. In the case of the Los Arcos that you have, it spends 4 years as a Fino. The Flor dies, and then it begins to oxidize, and oxidizes for 4 additional years. So, an average age of 8 years with that Amontillado you have. And then you have the Oloroso, which is 100% oxidative. It didn't see any time under the yeast. So it essentially just goes straight in the barrel and starts to oxidize for its entire life. And typically Olorosos are, 12 plus years, typically a bit older than the rest of the dry wine. So those are all the dry categories. And then we have the sweet end, where we have cream sherry. But within cream sherry, we have 3 different styles of cream sherry. We have a pale cream and a medium cream. These you don't really find that often in the market or out in the field. Typically, when you do, it's at a very high-end restaurant, and it might be on their dessert wine list or their aperitif list. But typically, you don't see the pale or the medium cream that often. The rich cream, like the Harvey's Bristol cream, which is like the foremost example and the one everyone knows, or for us, the East India, which is probably our most popular product. Those are what we call rich cream, and those are the ones that most people recognize out in the world. And those are the ones that are like port, in that they have the same sort of flavor profile. They're around the same sugar content. So the cream sherries are what most people think of when you say sherry. So we have those 3, and then we have the muscatel, which is the only sherry that utilizes the muscatel grape. And it's around 200 grams of sugar per liter. The rich cream's around 120. And then finally, on the far end, we have the PX sherry, and that's at least 400 grams of sugar per liter. And it uses the Pedro Jimenez grape exclusively. And so, these, the very, very, sweet wine, very viscous, very raisiny, almost like raisin juice. So, right there from off the bat, we have all of these different categories. And because we have these different categories and different styles, you have so much nuance into the production itself, just to, create these different products.
So going back to the other end of the scale with the Fino and the Manzanilla, obviously, this is, like we talked about, has been working on for a long time. I remember as I was reading this book, I was like, when I saw a reference to the Phoenicians, I was like, okay, we are back here now. Why in the first place is yeast, this Flor, this yeast layer, why is it introduced to the wine in the first place? Was it anything about preservation to keep it from going bad, or what was the decision to actually do this in the first place?
Well, so it's important to note that even though we have 3,000 years of history as far as sherry making is concerned, or wine making from the region, sherry, as we understand it today, really didn't start to get codified until the 19th century, and then officially was codified in 1935 when the Consejo Regulador was founded. They're the governing body that oversees all aspects of sherry production.
Got it.
So 1935 onward is really our understanding of sherry. But a lot of the bodegas like Lustau and Gonzalez Baez and Valdespino, a lot of the bigger houses, they were starting to be founded and the early to mid 1800s. Lustau was a bit later, 1896. So even though we have all this history, really pre 1800s, sherry was all over the place. I mean, uh, fortification really didn't start to happen until the Moors, sacked this part of the world, and I believe it was 711 AD. They weren't big drinkers, but they brought the gift of distillation to the area, because they were using distillation for medicinal purposes, like essential oils and things of that nature. So really, from 1000 BC up until when the Moors, conquered Spain, the wines were unfortified.
Got it.
And then from there on, fortification, there were times where they were, very heavily fortified. There were times where they were very lightly fortified, and everything in between. So it's just important to note that even though we have all this history, our understanding of what sherry is today is really only, 150 years old-ish. But really, what we're drinking today is less than 100 years old as far as, rules and regulations being put into place. As for the Flor that you're asking about, the Flor is never something that was added. It was just a naturally occurring phenomenon. The yeast, it's all over the grapes. It's in the wine. We do add a little bit of yeast in the beginning, but that's for fermentation. That's a completely separate, issue. The yeast that, the Flor, that just is naturally occurring in the wine. And the reason why it seals the wine shut, it floats to the top, is essentially it starts off in the wine. The yeast is consuming everything it can, all the sugar, all the oxygen, all the glycerin, to the point where it is a living organism. It needs more air. It has to float to the top of the wine to get more air to keep living. So when that happens, that's when this thin, veil of Flor, what we call, seals the wine shut, and that's what protects it from oxygen for, its entire life in the barrel. So it was never something that was decided upon. It was just something that occurred, that they noticed, and they kept doing it. And with that, being the only wine that is aged under a layer of yeast, you are getting those flavors that you don't really find anywhere else. Again, I mentioned earlier, very dry, less than 1 gram of sugar per liter. So essentially no sugar, very salty, briny, crisp, sharp, pungent flavors. And that's really due to, its time under the yeast. And most biologically aged wines are, around 4 to 8 years. But most of them are, closer to the 4-year mark.
Yeah. So first, thank you for clarifying kind of the timeline. I appreciate that. So obviously, yes, yeast plays a very key role in the fermentation process for anything as we kick it off. So is it really just, Stephen, then did it become an elective decision that to just leave the yeast in after it was when a traditional winemaker would pull it out for the flavors that it was creating? So I guess that's more the decision, the question then, as opposed to obviously an artificial addition, was it decided to leave the yeast in longer because we liked the flavor that came off? Because like we said, it's not always love at first taste.
Right. Yeah, I think it was more of, they realized that, oh, this is, very unique. It is a naturally occurring thing, the yeast floating to the top. And I think once they realized that, they're creating a very, very special wine that you don't really find anywhere else, I think they just kept producing it. And you're right, it's very jarring. It's for most people that want to get into dry sherry, say they are, Harvey's Bristol cream lovers, or, East India, cream, they're wanting to expand their sherry, palate. I usually start them off with the Amontillado because I feel it's the most approachable. You're encountering flavors that you might have come across before, like Madeira, Marsala. You're getting those oxidative notes. You can find those flavors elsewhere, and they're nutty and round. They're a bit more approachable versus the Fino is just very, very unique to the sherry world itself. And even to the point where if you ask a master sommelier about sherry, they usually, first thing that comes to their mind is Fino sherry because it acts so radically different. So I think it was really just that they kept producing it because they realized that they had something special on their hands.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, kind of walking people through, and we kind of touched a little bit, but so we have our Fino and our Manzanillas, which are really more distinguished by geography more than anything. But,
Mm-hmm.
you know, an Amontillado is something that then is kind of oxidatively aged. Do you mind going a little bit more into what that oxidative process looks like, and what does that transition look like in terms of flavors from a Fino to an Amontillado, or however you want to talk through that, please?
Sure, of course. So with the dual aging, as I mentioned, we start off as a Fino. The Fino and the Manzanilla, these wines are very, very delicate. So we only fortify them slightly, up to 15% alcohol, in that the yeast, the Flor, it won't survive above 16% alcohol. So we cannot fortify it any further. And so the way we make Amontillado is we have the Fino for 4 years. We fortify it a second time up to at least 8 or 17%. This kills the Flor, and then the wine starts to oxidize. And so with the oxidation, you're getting more alcohol concentration over time. You don't have that veil of yeast protecting the wine. So with that gone, you are now starting to lose water due to evaporation, or the angel share is what they would call it in the whiskey world. So because you're losing water over time, the wine is concentrating. Obviously, you're losing volume as well. And with that concentration, that's where the oxidation, you're really getting all those nutty flavors, those dark fruit flavors like plums and figs, almonds. That's really due to the oxidation. But the oxidation couldn't happen unless we fortified it up to 17%. And so with the Los Arcos Amontillado, I believe it's, we kill the yeast, we fortify it up to 17%, but by the time it gets bottled, it's at 18% because, again, you're getting that concentration over time.
Hmm. So if I was standing in, and for everybody out there, the terminology is so bodega is the facility where the wine is often aged. If I'm hopefully using my, so if I was staring at a barrel of Amontillado being oxidatively aged, is it going to visually look different than a Cabernet being aged in a barrel? Is there, in terms of what's allowing that oxidative process? You said part of it's the fortification. Are there other things being done to make sure that it's exposed to more air? Is there a new?
Well, I just think it's time.
Okay,
Most table wines aren't going to sit in a barrel for 8 years or longer.
got it.
So I really think it's just the time in the barrel is what really is contributing to the oxidation itself. Yeah, most table wines, I don't know what the average age would be, but let's say it's maybe 6 months or maybe a year. Sure, it's going to oxidize a little bit, but not like 8, 12 years, of sitting there. So, the time is really the most important factor here. And the same thing goes for whiskey. A lot of people try to, cut corners and, Instead of aging it in a big barrel, they might age it in smaller barrels to get more of that woody characteristic, but it's still, they're not taking into account that air plays a huge role in whiskey production. And it's the same thing here in sherry, even to the point that, the sherry butts are, much larger than a whiskey barrel, 600 liters. So about 3 times the size of a whiskey barrel. We fill these barrels only up to 500 liters. So we have that extra headspace either for the growth of the Flor, or in the case of the oxidatively aged wines, that extra space for air to impact the wine. So it's really about, time, impacting the wine and creating those oxidative flavors.
Hmm.
But
Okay.
as far as anything else goes, aside from the fortification, the wine production process is, really similar. You pick the grapes, you turn it into must, you get the wine up to, 12 to 14 degrees of alcohol, and then, you might lightly age it. So everything there is exactly the same. It's really just the addition of, the neutral brandy spirit to fortify the wine, and then just time in the barrel.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Got it. Thank you. So going back to Sherry's at times perception problem that we have with people where, it's obviously the metaphor, I'm sure you're sick of at this point. Like, oh, like, isn't that the thing you cook with or the thing that some snooty academic drinks? Like, if I am if I'm in the grocery store in like the cooking aisle and I see a bottle of sherry there versus whatever the best analogy would be in Lustau's portfolio. I'm sure the quality is very different, but what's the difference between what people think of in terms of a cooking sherry versus a sherry that they would buy from Lustau?
Yeah, I think it's just that it's quality. And when you say cooking sherry, the first thing that comes to mind is like Taylor's from California, and they have a whole range of Taylor's port, Taylor's sherry. And I think the only way they get away with that is because their company is so old. They were kind of grandfathered in. But technically, if you see Taylor's sherry on the shelf, legally it's not sherry because it has to be made in, it's very much like champagne. It has to come from this particular region. So a lot of the times when you see sherry in the grocery store, a lot of the times legally it might not be considered sherry, especially the Taylor's, which I think is the one that most people would use as far as cooking wines go. But as far as flavor goes, it's really just about quality. And that's really the only difference. Sherry is great to cook with. We have so many styles to play with. So we have a sherry for every, kind of food you could ever want. We're encountering flavors you don't come across. So that really, lends to creating a more complex and interesting dish. Like one of my favorite pairings is Amontillado sherry and mushrooms, home run. That umami character, with the, oxidative notes, it's a perfect pairing. So I think sherry is great for cooking just because they're, depending on which style you're working with, you have so many avenues to be creative. And it's the same thing in the cocktail world as well. So many different flavors, so many different styles. You could put a sherry into any, sort of classic cocktail build and it will work depending on what you're, going for.
To the cocktail world, and I do want to talk about food pairings, but since we're here, are there any, Stephen, and I know that obviously it is, you know, cocktails have really kind of helped give sherry impart this new home that it's enjoying right now, which is so cool to see. But are there any general pairing rules? So, okay, I've got Lustau's Manzanilla right here. I've got the Amontillado, like we talked about. If I'm starting, is it anything to do with type of spirit, aging, unaging? Does it really just go everywhere? I guess, are there any rules of thumb you might give people if they wanted to start experimenting at all?
Sure. With food pairings, there's an old saying, and I always kind of screw it up, but it helps you decide what meat to pair with the different styles of the dry sherry. So If it swims away from you, Fino Manzanilla. So it's great for, anything seafood. I would also say chicken, any sort of white meat. If it runs away from you, Amontillado, Palo Cortado. So now we're thinking more like duck and rabbit, gamier meats. Pork is another great one. And then if it runs towards you, Oloroso, so bison, bigger red meats, bolder flavors, great with like Korean barbecue. So as far as meats go, that's how you can remember which dry sherry to pair with the different meats. An easy, fail-proof pairing is cheeses and nuts. They can go with any of them, even the sweet sherries. If you want to, just play it safe, sherry with nuts and cheeses, you can't go wrong. So that's an easy, default to go to. And then for the sweeter sherries, of course, any sort of dessert. One of my favorite pairings is PX and blue cheese. Very, very sweet wine with very funky, sharp, pungent, cheese. The marriage of the two is really nice together. And then, of course, for the muscatel and the cream, any sort of chocolates, cream sherry and coffee is really good. Any sort of baked ingredients, the cream and the sweeter sherries, really stand out nicely.
Runs away versus runs towards. That
Yeah, no,
belongs on
that one is perfect. Yeah,
that
I
belongs on a
wish I could
billboard
think of
somewhere.
it. It does. It does.
uh, no, thank you for that. That's very, very helpful. Yeah, because I mean, certainly something we see in the cocktail sphere, which is so heartening, is like, oh, tequila may be best with a manzanilla or something like this, but then you of course see people find ways to work it in because they're using really creative builds that'll enable it to play a different starring role. And obviously there are sherry based cocktails. I feel like a no brainer, blow people's minds every day of the week. Handing somebody a well made sherry cobbler, is just like it will stop anybody in their tracks.
Yeah, it's one of our best drinks, hands down. It's one that's approachable. It's one that you can make seasonally, depending on the sherry and the fruit you want to use. It's great for accounts because it's cheap to make. So the return is, really good for bars and restaurants. Yeah, the sherry cobbler's a home run. It's the drink I pitch the most to accounts or markets that, maybe aren't as cocktail forward as, say, Chicago or New York. But yeah, the cobbler's a home run. And then within that, you have a couple other classic cocktails, the Adonis and the Bamboo, which essentially are just sherry-based Manhattans and martinis. But then from there, sherry really shines as a plug and play product in that take any classic cocktail and you could plug and play sherry into it. My favorite one to show people is let's do a Fino daiquiri. Get rid of the white rum or maybe do a split base if you still want to have the rum, ounce of rum, ounce of Fino, and then, of course, lime juice and sugar. But that one, if you're using just sherry, that's the one that blows people away because the sharp acidity and the salinity paired with the lime juice is a home run. It's a dangerous drink because it's so enjoyable and refreshing. And then also, it's a great tool to lower, the ABV in a lot of the classic cocktails. So, let's say we do want a Manhattan, but, maybe we don't want 2 ounces of whiskey. Do an ounce of whiskey, an ounce of sherry, and an ounce of sweet vermouth. You have now lowered your cost. You've lowered the ABV. So now people might order 2 instead of 1. And you're also adding a little complexity. So now you're adding some nuttiness and some, dark fruit notes to the Manhattan. It's really a great way across the board to create a much more interesting drink. And so I think that's how you're seeing sherry being utilized most is you're seeing these classic cocktail builds and they're just plugging and playing, sherry, either as a base ingredient or a split base between, sherry and the base spirit and then they're adding some sort of, elegant or creative liqueur or homemade syrup. But really, with cocktails go, I kind of look at it like math equations. It's like you have this basic equation, and from here, it's like, well, a gimlet and a daiquiri are, pretty much the same thing. It's just one's gin, one's rum. And it's so you take these few equations and, plug and play these different products, and it allows you to, create some really interesting cocktails at the end.
Mm. Yeah, and here's to the low proof cocktail for keeping us all out a little longer, right?
Right, exactly. I feel like I've been talking about low ABV for, well, I've been with Lustau 7 years now. I feel like only within the last year or two are we really starting to see that on a consumer end. People are buying more spritzes. I think COVID really helped that as well. People migrating to White Claws and canned cocktails, but there truly is an interest now in lower ABV drinks. And so it's a great time to be in the sherry world and the fortified wine world for that matter, because there is an interest in, drinking less alcohol, not getting blasted at lunch, like back in the 50s, a 2 martini lunch. Well, it's like, well, when the martini is 6 ounces of liquor and you have two of them, yeah, you're going to be plastered. So it's a nice time that we're living in, that, we are, drinking more mindfully.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. One quick thing before I forget, and, obviously it could be a little bit of experimentation, but if you were doing your lower proof Manhattan, would you be doing like in Oloroso, kind of on those deeper oxidative notes potentially, or where would you be leaning for your sherry ad right there?
I would say it would depend on the whiskey, but yeah, Amontillado, Palo Cortado, or Oloroso. And from there, it would really just depend on, are we using rye? Are we using bourbon? Which bourbon are we using? So, I would most likely experiment with all three and see which one worked best. But I would really try to tailor it towards the whiskey and also the sweet vermouth as well. That makes a huge difference in, any cocktail is using, a nice quality vermouth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, but as far as, plugging and playing sherry into cocktails, I mean, obviously, Fino Manzanilla, any sort of vodka drink, gin drink, or white rum drink, it'll work well. For Amontillado, Palo Cortado, Oloroso, and, darker spirits, dark rum, whiskeys, scotches. And then even, getting into the liqueurs, like Fino would be great with like a chartreuse, any sort of herbal liqueur or aquavit. So, just from right there, identifying, which sherries would be, good in conjunction with, the, standard based spirits. From there, you can really start to, be creative and, experiment just by, kind of narrowing down, which lane should these sherries stand. And that being said, because we have so many talented people behind the bar these days, I have seen a gin martini with Amontillado in it, and it works well. It tastes great. So it's not like these are set in stone rules, but these are just more like guidelines. Typically, these are how these are used in cocktails.
Yeah, and I think just for the curious person at home, it's this idea of where at least can I start? Because, as opposed to where obviously our bartenders and mixologists pushing the field, which is always just really, really cool in that regard.
Right. So yeah, I think the best place to start is, pick your favorite classic cocktail. And if it's whiskey based, then do whiskey and an oxidative wine. If it's, gin based, then yeah, do a Fino Manzanilla, and just see how you can incorporate sherry into these classic drinks, because it really is the easiest way to add sherry to your repertoire.
Got it. Something I heard you make mention of before, but not go into detail on. I don't know if there's anything worth expounding on here. You've certainly um, talking about the importance of the Jerez lifestyle, and so I don't know if that threads into sherry, but for people that, hey, everybody talks about being restless from a travel standpoint right now, pitch them on heading to the triangle? What are they going to encounter there? And what should they do if they are there?
Right. I mean, it's a very special part of the world. It blew me away. I didn't really know what to expect. I mean, the first time I went to Jerez, we flew into Madrid, which Madrid's a beautiful city. It has a vibe that I feel like you could transplant Madrid into any of the European countries, and it would feel at home. I feel like Barcelona is different. Like that is inherently unique to Spain, and I always like to say it's like the San Francisco in Europe, as far as it's on the bay, the weather, the feel. But when you go further south down to Jerez and Sevilla, completely different lifestyle, much more lax, laid back. Sevilla is arguably the most beautiful place I've ever been to. I mean, the city is just gorgeous, and it's just outside the triangle, maybe 20 or 30 minutes via train. So it's easily accessible. But yeah, the lifestyle in the sherry realm is much more laid back. The architecture is really interesting because you've had all these different, people occupying this territory. You see Roman architecture, you see Moorish architecture, you see some influence from the Brits when, they sacked Cadiz in the 1600s. So you're seeing all these different influences impacting this part of the world that you just don't really get in the rest of Spain. The rest of Spain is very Spanish, but once you get down there, it really is this melting pot of culture. So for me, I think that's one of the most interesting things is it definitely stands out from the rest of the country as far as just the architecture and the feel and the way of life. I don't want to say it's behind the time, but I remember walking around Jerez for the first time, and it's like, God, I feel like I'm trapped in like 1985 or something. It's just as far as the feel and the vibe of the place. So yeah, it's very special. It's definitely worth visiting. If anything, Sevilla, is right there. Is definitely worth checking out. But then also, if you're thinking about going to this, part of the world, I would really recommend going in the springtime. They have an event called La Feria, and I still have not been. I'm hoping I will go this coming spring for the first time. But it's essentially Spain's Mardi Gras, and it happens in the south, the southwest Andalusia, with Sevilla being the main town. But it's really just a big party for an entire week. Lots of sherries consumed. They have a drink called the Rebojito, which is essentially sherry and Sprite, like some sort of lemon lime soda. That's kind of like the official La Feria drink, because it's refreshing, and you can drink it all day long because it's low ABV. But yeah, the feeling down in Jerez is definitely much different than the other parts of Spain that I've been to.
When obviously we talked about, I mentioned, and because I've heard you say, hey, it's we're representing the category of sherry, but whether it's bottles people can find in their store beyond Lustau, or if they were there, are there a couple of sherry houses in particular that they're all wonderful, let's say, but are there a couple places in particular that are really special in your mind?
Yeah, and I do feel like of the bigger bodegas, like we'll say the top five, each one really does have something great to offer. I think Lustau stands out in the fact that we're one of the few houses with a complete lineup, and the lineup is solid across the board. We're the only house that makes a biologically aged wine aged in the three different towns. So that's something that, helps us stand out from the pack as well. That being said, I mean, I would really have to go category by category, but my favorite Manzanilla, Barbadillo makes a fantastic Manzanilla. I mean, for me, that's what they do well. The Soliar is a fantastic biologically aged wine, and I had the privilege of drinking that straight out of the barrel. So that's one house I really adore. El Maestro Sierra is another one. Very, very small house, very rustic. Random, sized barrels scattered throughout. I remember they had this one huge barrel that you could literally walk in. It was, so big. but very old school. I think they were even still using egg whites to, help filter out some of the wine using, older techniques. So that's one bodega that I really enjoyed. Of course, Valdespino and Gonzalez Baez have products that I think are great. Valdespino, I remember I tried an 80-year-old Muscatel from Valdespino probably in like 2018 for Sherry Fest back in New York, and it blew me away. It was so good. But then there are other bodegas that you don't see in the States, that are really only available in Spain. Like Urium was one I hadn't heard of before, and we went to their bodega, and man, their Palo Cortado really blew me away. I really liked all the wines that they were making, but they just aren't available in the States. So I would say any of the larger bodega houses, you're going to find a really good quality wine. I just feel like different houses specialize in different styles, whereas Lustau is really trying to make more of a codified front. Like we want all of the wines to be superlative. It might not be your favorite Oloroso or your favorite Palo Cortado, but you can't say that it's not really good and high quality. And I think that's why we've become sort of the default cocktail sherries, because sure, maybe Fino Harana might not be your first choice for, Fino by the glass, but it works great in a cocktail. It's solid, it's reliable, it stands out in the drink itself. So I think that's what really makes Lustau stand out from a lot of the other houses, is we do have a really solid, complete lineup.
I will say, Stephen has offered me nothing in return for this, but the number of bartenders I know who talk about Lustau first when it comes to their cocktails it's definitely by far the top mention. So, and something that's also important to say too regarding Lustau and just many of these products, especially when you're getting out of stuff that hasn't been aged for forever or is exceptionally rare. I can buy a bottle of Amontillado here in the market for $20, and that, doing the math, people, in terms of that's an eight years of aging. You're paying for $20 for while something that may be unique if you've not tried it before, it's an exceptional price for great quality wine for sure.
Absolutely. I think bang for your buck, quality versus price point, you cannot beat Sherry. I mean, all of our wines are, rated 90 points or higher if, you care about that sort of thing. I know a lot of consumers do, and it is a good benchmark, for people who don't really know, wine that well. But just Sherry in general, bang for your buck, like you said, a lot of time and effort and care has gone into these products. And when you can buy, a 95 point wine for $20, it's like, why wouldn't you?
Mm-hmm. Stephen, part of people understanding the category is like, oh, like what is a dry wine versus what is a sweet wine and whatnot. But, and we mentioned, Taylor's from California, not technically sherry. Are there, and I don't know if there would be any, but if someone's at the store, one, this is my plug. Lustau is a great place to start. But are there any general watch outs you would have? Hey, you're looking at sherry as a category. Anything you'd consider avoiding or just not starting with to make sure that people don't end up with garbage or something? So we probably not a Fino or Manzanilla if it's your first buy.
Right.
But any watch outs in terms of quality at all? Anything they might be able to pick up on?
Not really. If
Okay.
it is a certified sherry from Spain, if it has the DO symbol on the bottle, which they all should, I would say you're good to go. I
Okay.
mean, they're all putting out really high quality wines. It's just the ones that legally shouldn't be considered sherry. Those are the ones I'd steer clear from. So, like if you see a big jug, 1.5 liter jug of sherry, don't buy it. That's no one in Jerez is pouring sherry or bottling sherry in 1.5 liter, jugs, unless it's, for a novelty. I think we have a few East India bottles that are like 5 feet tall, something like that, just for novelty's sake. But as far as stuff you find on the shelf on a regular basis, if it's more than a 750 ml, I would say don't buy it.
Good. Yep. And I think since it's still even a thing at moments, the the mover and shaker people have their magnet that I've got on my fridge that says, hey, like if you're reading this, put the vermouth in the fridge. Your sherry, like wine, needs to be you know what? Talk to us a minute about shelf life of product too,
Of
please.
course. Well, sure. So the great thing is they are fortified, so they will last longer. The ones you really only need to really worry about are the Fino and the Manzanilla. You got about a week, maybe 10 days if you're using it in cocktails, maybe a bit longer if you're batching it with a high proof spirit. And that will, of course, up the shelf life. But because the Fino and Manzanilla have been protected by oxygen their whole life, once you crack open that bottle, I mean, oxygen's going to just start trying to make up for lost time. And so they really will turn at a week. So those are the ones you only need to worry about. And then like the Amontillado onward, Amontillado, Palo Cortado, Oloroso, I would say a month to 2 months, depending on the ABV. And then the cream sherry, maybe 6 months. And then the Muscatel and the PX, 6 months to a year. To be honest, I've had a bottle of PX in my fridge for years. It's not like it goes bad. It might not taste as fresh, but it is fortified and there's 400 grams of sugar in it. It's very well preserved. So it's not like the Fino where you taste it and you realize, oh, it's turning. It doesn't really turn. It just doesn't really taste quite as vibrant as it did a year or two ago. But yeah, the main rule of thumb is just keep them on either on ice if you're at a bar or in the fridge. So they should live there. And then the Fino Manzanilla, you got about a week if you're going to be serving it by the glass.
Got it. Thank you. Something I'm curious about from my own perspective. I'm not probably looking to become, get into the sherry biz anytime soon. But when I've heard you speak before, you also talked about some of Lustau, and I noticed some other houses have it, some various varieties of online education for sherry, like some various certifications and whatnot. Are any of those good for the enthusiast, but not someone who's looking to be, who is a som that's looking for an add-on?
Right. So, I mean, there really are only two courses available. The, certified sherry wine, master of sherry certification that you get from the DO in Jerez. And I did that in 2016. And then there's the course that Lustau started, probably 5 years ago, the CSWS, the Certified Sherry Wine Specialist course. This is where I would start. It's online. There's two of us offer the course. Lucas, who is our brand educator, that's essentially all he focuses on are the online courses because we took it online. It's really exploded to the point where he really just needs to focus on that. I teach the same course but geared more towards trade, so distributors or special industry events. But I usually offer the course to the trade in person. So I would say the CSWS is a great place to start for people who are interested in learning more about sherry. It's a great course. It's very thorough. I would say, if the Master Sherry course is here, the CSWS isn't, far behind. It's a solid intermediate course with a lot of content. The manual is 100 pages, so we do cover a lot of ground and you do need to study. But that's where I would start. And, if you take the course and pass it, you will really have a great understanding of, not only the region, why it's important, even talking about the different winds that impact the sherry region and how that, is ideal for fuller growth and things of that nature. If you take the CSWS course, you will really leave with a solid understanding of what sherry is, the region itself, and why it's unique and special.
I will say as a follow-up to that, this guy right here, the Manzanilla, I remember when I read the description, and what does it say here on the back? It says something about hint of sea breeze. And I swear, people, and maybe it's just Stephen and his power of suggestion, but I remember drinking this and being like, God damn, this smells like the ocean. Like it was like wild.
Yeah. And I think there might be a small hint of truth to this. But not really. In that people think the saltiness comes because these wines are aged close to the ocean. And although maybe there might be a hint of truth to that, if you think about like things in a freezer And like, you know how some, like if it's been in there long enough, one item might pick up flavors from the other item that it's in there. So I think there might be a hint of truth to that because the floor is situated close to the ocean, that maybe some of the salt is getting deposited into the floor. But really, in actuality, that saltiness and brininess is really just coming from the yeast impacting the wine.
Sure.
So yeah, it's really more about the floor versus the ocean itself is impacting the wine. But I think there might be a very small hint of truth to that, that I would be interested to see, you know, if you were to try to make the same wine. Well, and even Jerez is a good example. For me, I always tend to drink either Manzanilla from San Lucar or a Fino from El Puerto because it's closer to the ocean. These wines are typically a bit more funkier, have a bit more character. From, you know, Jerez is further inland, farther removed from the water. So I don't want to say they're not as good, but I would say they're more one note. Whereas I feel there's more nuance and complexity from San Lucar and El Puerto. And part of that is due to the water, in that, you know, because they're close to the water, their temperatures don't fluctuate quite as much during the year. Whereas in Jerez, it gets much hotter, you know, and it's much more arid. So it's a little less ideal for the floor growth. But yeah, I think you can find some great complexity from the wines from San Lucar and El Puerto.
So I have two other little things I want to cover before we wrap up. And if there's anything we haven't covered you want to talk about, that's great. So one, while we'll already have passed, we're right in the middle of International Sherry Week right now. What and you mentioned before we started recording that there's some interesting activations happening right now. What's happening in the world of sherry right now on a more contemporary basis? What might people find if they were out right now?
Yeah, so it's really a you know, concerted effort from all the bodegas, really just trying to raise awareness about sherry. And so this could be, you know, a pairing dinner. It could be you know, a happy hour feature with, you know, sherry cocktails. I'm actually doing one here on Friday at Jaleo, you know, Jose Andres's spot, and we're going to feature a sherry paired with a dish. We're going to feature a cocktail, and then we're going to feature sherry, you know, pours by the glass. So things of this nature, just little, you know, pop-ups here and there, just really trying to, you know, showcase sherry to your everyday consumer. Yeah, typically happy hours, pairing dinners. We just did a sherry cobbler cocktail competition in DC to kick off Sherry Week, and my coworker Mario flew in from Spain for that. But yeah, so things of this nature, you know, you'll be seeing more sherry cocktails being featured throughout this week is probably the thing you'll see the most. And then from there, you know, more elevated places, Spanish, you know, restaurants, they might do, you know, some sort of sherry pairing dinner where a different sherry is paired with 5 to, you know, 7 courses or more, depending on, you know, where you're going.
Very good. One of the thing I've noticed more recently, at least in my market, and maybe it's 18 months ago, but I did see Lustau, at least to me, is now or has been for a while, but it's in the vermouth game now. And
Yes.
so tell us a little bit about that, you know, vermouth very quickly for anybody else not caught up. So vermouth is also another fortified wine out there. And typically, you know, primary flavored with wormwood being its bittering agent. But tell us a little bit about Lustau's product and why did you guys decide to get into this game? Or have you been doing it for a long time?
So it is relatively new to the US market. The Rojo, the red vermouth, has been around the longest. I think we launched that in the States 2016 is when the red launched. And then maybe a year or two later, the Blanco launched. And then the new Rosé, the Rosado, we launched that in the middle of COVID. So that one is still being discovered by a lot of people. But we launched them in the States because you know, low ABV and fortified wines are, you know, really picking up, and there's a strong interest in it. But B, and more importantly, vermouth is a huge part of Spanish drinking culture. I would say more so than sherry, to be honest with you, to the point where if you go, walking around bar hopping in Madrid, you will definitely come across a bar with a vermouth machine, like a Jägermeister machine, just hit the button and it, cold vermouth comes out from the tap. So, vermouth and soda, vermouth on the rocks, these things are consumed, very much in Spain. Whereas sherry, I definitely would say is more towards, the sherry part of Spain, the Jerez region. Outside of the region, you don't see, sherry being consumed as much, but vermouth is huge across the entire country of Spain. So that's really, what it boils down to. It's a part of, their culture. And we wanted to, showcase that. And then, of course, with Lustau, which makes ours stand out from some of the other Spanish vermouths, they are sherry based. So, you're getting really high quality wine that's being used. We're using the same Fino or Amontillado that we use, to bottle the Los Arcos and the Papirusa. And with that, because we're using sherries, there's no added sugar. A lot of vermouth, they take essentially like, okay, we have a batch of red wine. It's not good enough to be bottled and served as a table wine, but we don't want to throw it away. What do? We aromatize the wine and we add sugar to it. And now we have a vermouth. So with that, we're not really trying to be sustainable in that way. Like, we're just intentionally trying to make a good wine. So we're using high quality wines as a base. Because we're using sherry, we're using sweeter sherries to sweeten the wine. So we're using PX or an unaged muscatel to sweeten the wines versus adding sugar to it. So it is all natural residual sugar. And yeah, because they're sherry based, you are getting those sherry's flavors that accompany, the standard vermouth profiles that you find out there.
Yeah, I've had the Rosado and the Rojo, but I've not had the Blanco yet. The Blanco I momentarily saw and then it was gone. And isn't that the story of everything right now?
That's
So
right. I mean, I like all three, but I think for me, I prefer the Blanco the most, just because it's the most unique. I think if you were to, put it side by side with like a Carpano Bianco, some of the other notable Bianco vermouths, the flavor profile of Lustau's Bianco vermouth is really radically different in a great way for me. It's very rosemary, gentian forward, very herbaceous. And so I think it's a really outstanding, unique style of Bianco vermouth. The red is fantastic. I could drink it all day long. I love it to death, but it's very what you would expect from a sweet red as far as flavor profile goes. And then the Rosado is, I like to tell people, like, that's kind of our entry level vermouth. You're wanting to get into vermouth. It's not quite as bitter. It's a bit more rounded out, notes of vanilla and nutmeg. It's a bit more approachable. So I think that's a great option for people who are, trying to get into vermouth. Maybe start here. It's not quite as bitter and, it's a bit more approachable flavor profile wise.
got it. Terrific. Is there anything, Stephen, we haven't covered that you wanted to get into at all today?
I don't think so. I think we've really covered everything without going too deep into the production aspect of it. One thing that should be mentioned that most people either overlook or don't know, I think it's important to talk about. Standard pour for sherry is 3 ounces. I see this happen a lot. A lot of bars will give you a 2-ounce pour. Technically, and this is coming not from Lustau, but this is from the Consejo itself. Sherry should be a 3-ounce pour. And I would say even go a step further. If you're pouring Fino or Manzanilla, it is only 15% alcohol. You could pour them a 5-ounce pour, and it's still the same ABV level as some table wines. So I like to, give a generous pour with the Fino and Manzanilla, because they're not going to get tanked. Like if you were to pour 5 ounces of Oloroso, you're definitely going to feel it. It's 20% alcohol. But with the Fino Manzanilla, it's good because, it's in keeping with what's happening with the rest of the wine world, but also it ensures you that you're not letting it go to waste, by it sitting in the fridge for more than a week. And now, well, I have this Fino I can't use. I got to get rid of it somehow. I might cook with it or just toss it out. So by pouring 5 ounces by the glass, you're ensuring that you're getting rid of the wine before it turns. So that's one thing that I think at least 3 ounces for everything. And then the other thing, most people think that it needs to be in the small little copita glasses. The Consejo Regulador is really, trying to get people to just move to white wine glasses. There's so much that's going on as far as aroma goes with sherry that, the smaller copitas just really don't capture it as well. So a white wine glass is the standard glass that the Consejo Regulador does want people to use. So don't feel like if you're at home, you need to go out and buy, fancy sherry glasses. If you're becoming an enthusiast, actually, we just want you to use a white wine glass. So those are two things that I think most people either don't know about or overlook, or, it's a 3 ounce pour and just use a white wine glass. You don't need to use something too fancy. Aside from that, we talked about shelf life. We didn't talk about the grapes. Just quick notes.
Yeah.
Even though you have so many different colors going on with the sherries, they are all white grapes. You have the Palomino Fino, which that's used exclusively for all the dry sherries. You have the Muscatel, which is used exclusively just for the Muscatel sherry. And then you have the Pedro Jimenez grape, the PX, that's used for both PX sherry, and it's blended in with the cream. I failed to mention earlier, cream sherry is typically a blend of Oloroso sweetened with PX. So yeah, 3 white grapes, and all the color is really coming from the barrel and oxidation. So it's not like we're using red grapes. Now, I will say that, and this might change actually, because I think sometime this year, the new laws will be put into place. The first time since 1935, the Consejo Regulador has made changes to sherry production as far as requirements go. So I know that one for sure is they're going to do away with the sherry triangle. No longer do you have to age the wine in one of the 3 towns, but now you can age it in any of the 9 municipalities that make up the sherry region. So say you have a winery in, La Brija, which is, a little bit further removed from Jerez. You currently, as it stands, you can make the wine there, but if you want it to be considered sherry, you would have to ship the wine into one of the 3 towns to be aged. They're going to do away with that. As long as it's, made and aged in any of the 9 municipalities, it will be considered sherry. So it's a very exciting time, because that means it's going to open up the door for these smaller producers to come to market, because they don't have to worry about the additional cost to ship it into one of the towns and age it there. You're going to start seeing some, smaller boutique sherries come to the market. And then also, and I don't know which grapes are going to be authorized, but I know they're going to open up the door for some other indigenous grapes to the region to be used for sherry production. Like I know pre-Consejo Regulador, they were using both Palomino Fino, which they're using now, but also Palomino Negro. So they were using a different style of Palomino. A red skin grape. So we might, see some red grapes, being used in sherry production. I just don't know if that's actually going to be the case until the laws are signed. So it's a very fun time to be in the sherry world, because these changes are going to, be put in place soon. And it's really going to open up the door for some, smaller, interesting wineries to come to the market. So it's a fun time to be in the sherry world.
Got it. And so, yeah, I would imagine that at that point in time, if I suppose people could be already aging Palomino Negro just for fun, but otherwise they could sign it, but we'll also be waiting a handful of years between all the aging and whatnot, and actually for it to get to the market. So
right, exactly. So yeah, say they put the law in place today, well, we're probably not going to see that wine in the market for 4 or 5 years, just because that's typically how long it takes to make a Fino or Manzanilla, or even longer if you're going to be doing an oxidative wine. So yeah, the changes will happen soon, but we won't see the results of the changes for probably about 5 more years. Unless some small bodega out there was very intuitive and they already have some made, just waiting for the laws to change. But I think that will be probably very slim to none chance that has happened.
Right. Stephen, this has been great. In terms of people keeping up with Lustau or anything you're doing, are there places they should be looking you guys up on the old internet at all?
Yeah, of course, our social media handles, at Bodegas Lustau, for all the, different platforms of social media. Of course, our website, lustau.es, but another one, Sherry Journey. Lots of articles on sherry. I usually do a monthly cocktail article, talking about some sort of famous, notable cocktail and then make a sherry-based version of it. But also articles. Lucas writes a lot of articles on all sorts of different aspects of sherry and the history of sherry and Jerez brandy. So I would say Sherry Journey, outside of the standard Lustau plugs, Sherry Journey is a great resource for you as far as learning more about the category itself.
Got it. Terrific. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to chat today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun talking about sherry.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. The show notes for today's episode are available at decodingcocktails.com/podcast. If you'd like to keep up with what we're working on, there are two great ways to do so. One, our short weekly newsletter, Cocktail Confidential, which you can sign up for at decodingcocktails.com/newsletter. Or give us a follow on Instagram at Decoding Cocktails. If you think this podcast is great stuff, we'd love it if you'd subscribe or, of course, share an episode with a friend. The Decoding Cocktails podcast is produced by Chris Bay and myself. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon, and happy cocktailing.